All right, so let's talk about this chap, General Michael Langley. He's a pretty big deal in American military circles, the head of US Africa Command, or AFRICOM as it's snappily known. Think of him as the Pentagon's main man for all things Africa. Now, when Matt Gaetz was drilling General Langley, he used the term core values in his response. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? Like something you'd find on a motivational poster in a very well-meaning but slightly out-of-touch school counselor's office. These values, he says, are things like democracy, human rights, and crucially for a military man, civilian control over the armed forces. You know, the kind of stuff that makes everyone nod along sagely at international conferences. He suggests these aren't just American values or Western values, but universal principles that everyone should be aspiring to. It's the diplomatic equivalent of saying, we all want what's best, right? And on the surface, who could argue with that? Democracy is generally preferred over, say, a surprise dictatorship popping up overnight. Human rights? Yes, please. A full serving of those for everyone. Civilian control of the military. Absolutely, nobody wants the generals deciding what's for tea, let alone national policy. It all sounds perfectly reasonable, like a healthy diet of political vegetables that will make nations strong and prosperous, a global utopia just waiting to happen. But here's where it gets a bit, shall we say, complicated, like when your friend insists their new miracle diet is universally amazing, but you suspect it mostly involves them eating kale while secretly judging your life choices. These core values, when presented by a powerful Western general to African nations, can carry a different weight. They can feel less like friendly advice and more like a checklist for acceptance into the Good Countries Club. And as we all know, club memberships often come with unspoken rules and expectations, especially when the club president holds a lot of the cards, or in this case, a significant chunk of global influence. So the question isn't just what these core values are, but what purpose do they serve when they're being championed by one of the world's foremost military powers in its dealings with a continent that has a rather lengthy and, shall we say, history with Western powers? Are they truly a beacon of universal good, or could they also be just perhaps a very polite, very well-dressed tool for encouraging certain behaviors that align rather neatly with Western interests? Let's dive in, shall we? Because this is where the plot, like a good stew, starts to thicken quite nicely. Now, if you put on your Pan-African thinking cap, it's a very stylish cap, by the way, probably designed by a brilliant artist from Accra or Lagos. This whole core values discussion starts to look a bit different. Pan-African thinkers, people who've spent a lot of time considering Africa's place in the world and its path to true self-determination, tend to raise an eyebrow. They've seen this movie before, or at least a similar script with different actors. They argue that often what's presented as universal is actually quite culturally specific, usually reflecting the historical and political development of Western nations. It's like someone saying everyone loves a good cue, when in reality some cultures are more about enthusiastic, organized chaos. From this perspective, these core values can feel less like shared ideals and more like a set of terms and conditions for engaging with the West. You want development aid? Better tick the democracy box. You want military cooperation? Make sure that civilian control is looking spotless. It's almost like needing the Wi-Fi password to get into the global cafe. The password just happens to be written in a Western font. This isn't to say democracy or human rights are bad. Far from it. But the concern is about who defines them, who measures them, and whose interests are ultimately being served when they're promoted so vigorously by external powers. Think about it. Many African nations are relatively young, still shaping their own political systems after decades, sometimes centuries of colonial rule, which funnily enough wasn't too big on democracy or civilian control for the locals. So when the West comes along and says, here are the values you need to adopt, it can sound a bit rich. It's like the person who broke your leg then offers you a lecture on the importance of proper running technique. The intentions might even be good sometimes, but the historical context makes the delivery a tad awkward, if not downright suspicious for those on the receiving end of such advice. So for many Pan-Africanists, these core values aren't necessarily a benign gift of enlightenment. They can be perceived as a sophisticated instrument of soft power, a way to ensure that African countries develop in a manner that is predictable, amenable, and, crucially, aligned with the economic and geopolitical strategies of Western nations. It's a subtle form of pressure, a gentle nudge that always seems to push Africa in a direction that coincidentally benefits those doing the nudging. The question then becomes, are these values truly for Africa's autonomous development, or are they the velvet glove over an iron hand of influence? Let's take a look at Burkina Faso, a country that's been through a fair bit of turbulence lately. Young military leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, comes to power, and suddenly things aren't quite going according to the usual script. He's making noises about national sovereignty, questioning long-standing security partnerships, particularly with France, and looking to diversify his country's international friends. Now, enter General Langley and his emphasis on core values like civilian rule and democratic processes. It doesn't take a political science degree to see how this rhetoric can be, and often is, interpreted as a direct message to leaders like Traoré. When Langley speaks about the importance of a swift return to constitutional order or the dangers of military governments, it's hard not to hear it as a form of diplomatic policing. It's like the school prefect reminding everyone of the rules, especially the new kid who seems to be colouring outside the lines. The implication is clear. Leaders who don't conform to these Western-defined core values might find themselves on the naughty list. This could mean reduced aid, diplomatic isolation, or just a general sense of disapproval from powerful global players. It's a powerful way to shape behaviour without ever having to issue a direct order. The situation in Burkina Faso is complex, rooted in deep-seated issues of security, governance, and economic disparity. Traoré's rise is, in part, a response to a perceived failure of previous governments and their international partners to address these challenges effectively, particularly the spread of extremist violence. So when the core values lecture arrives from Washington, it can feel disconnected from the urgent on-the-ground realities. It's like being told to worry about the colour of the curtains when the house is on fire. The priorities might just be a little different for those actually inside the burning building. This focus on values can also serve to delegitimize leaders who don't fit the preferred mold. If a leader like Traoré is seen as deviating from the democratic path, it becomes easier to paint his administration as illegitimate, regardless of any popular support he might have or the specific circumstances that led to his leadership. It's a subtle but effective way of ensuring that the right kind of leaders are in place. Right often meaning those who are more amenable to Western interests and perspectives. The values test, therefore, becomes a gatekeeping mechanism, controlling who gets a seat at the international table and on what terms. This kind of moralizing pressure isn't exactly a new dance move in international relations. Now, US President Donald Trump is in the White House again. He isn't exactly known for his subtle diplomatic overtures. Look at his very public spat with South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa concerning South Africa's land reform policies. Trump tweeted about large-scale killing of farmers and instructing his Secretary of State to look into land expropriation. All based on some rather dubious information. It was a classic case of using a moral panic to critique and attempt to influence the domestic policy of a sovereign nation. The language might have been cruder, less polished than General Langley's talk of core values, but the underlying mechanism was strikingly similar. Both instances involve a powerful Western figure using a platform of supposed moral concern. Farmer safety for Trump, democracy and civilian rule for Langley, to question and exert pressure on African leaders and their policy choices. It's like your neighbor loudly commenting on the state of your lawn, implying your whole approach to gardening and perhaps life is fundamentally flawed. It's not just about the lawn, it's about asserting a certain standard. President Ramaphosa, to his credit, pushed back firmly against Trump's assertions, highlighting the inaccuracies and the problematic nature of such external interference. South Africa's land reform is an incredibly sensitive and complex issue, deeply rooted in the legacy of apartheid and colonialism. It's about addressing historical injustices and creating a more equitable society. To have it reduced to a simplistic, alarmist narrative by an external leader was, to put it mildly, unhelpful. It was an attempt to delegitimize a legitimate, albeit challenging, process of national redress by framing it as a violation of certain values, in Trump's case, a very specific interpretation of property rights. What this comparison shows is a recurring pattern, the use of moral language, whether it's about core values or humanitarian concerns, as a lever to influence African policy and delegitimize African agency. When African nations pursue paths that diverge from Western preferences, whether it's land reform in South Africa or new security alliances in Burkina Faso, this moral framework is often deployed. It effectively says, you're not just making a policy choice we disagree with, you're violating fundamental principles. This shifts the debate from a discussion among equals to a lecture from a self-appointed moral guardian, which is rarely a good starting point for genuine partnership. Now, let's talk about Burkina Faso's gold. The country is one of Africa's largest gold producers. That's a lot of bling, a lot of potential wealth. For years, international mining companies, many with strong links to Western economies, have been extracting this gold, and while they've been doing that, the pronouncements from Western capitals about good governance in Burkina Faso have sometimes felt a bit selective. It seems the volume of concern about values can fluctuate, depending on who is benefiting from the resources. It's like having a neighbor who only complains about your loud music when it's not their favorite band playing. When Captain Traoré's government starts making moves to get a better deal from its mineral wealth, perhaps by reviewing mining contracts or seeking new partners who might offer different terms, suddenly the spotlight on governance and stability intensifies. It's fascinating how quickly a country's internal political arrangements become an international concern when resource flows might be disrupted or rechanneled. The rhetoric of core values can then appear to serve as a convenient justification for scrutinizing and potentially pressuring a government that's trying to assert more control over its own economic destiny. Consider the historical context. For decades, African resources have fueled industries and economies elsewhere, often with limited tangible benefit trickling down to the local populations. The contracts signed, the deals made, were not always models of transparency or equitable benefit sharing. Yet the international discourse didn't always scream crisis of values back then, did it? There was often a quieter, more accommodating tone when things were, shall we say, ticking along nicely for external interests. This selective application of concern is what breeds cynicism about the true intent behind the core values push. So when leaders like Traoré talk about economic sovereignty, about ensuring that Burkina Faso's gold benefits Burkinabe citizens first and foremost, it's a direct challenge to an old, established order. And the core values argument can feel like a way to push back against this challenge, to maintain a system where African resources are readily accessible on terms favorable to external powers. The silence around past exploitations, contrasted with the loud alarm bells when an African nation tries to change the game, speaks volumes. It suggests the values might be more about maintaining access than upholding universal principles. So, let's swing back to South Africa and its incredibly thorny but absolutely vital issue of land reform. This isn't just about farming, it's about rectifying one of the most profound injustices of apartheid, the systematic dispossession of black South Africans from their ancestral lands. When the South African government, under President Ramaphosa, talks about land expropriation without compensation, with caveats, it's important to note, like not undermining food security or the economy, it's a serious attempt to address a deep historical wound and a major source of inequality. It's a conversation the country needs to have, and frankly is having. Yet what often happens, international commentators, politicians, and certain media outlets in the West frequently frame this debate in quite alarming terms. We hear concerns about property rights, often without acknowledging how those rights were acquired in the first place. Dire predictions of economic collapse reminiscent of Zimbabwe, a comparison often used to scare rather than inform, and a general sense that South Africa is heading down a dangerous path. This external concern often conveniently overlooks the pressing need for social justice and equitable land distribution within South Africa itself. This narrative, often amplified by powerful global voices, feeds directly into the core values framework. The argument implicitly becomes, if you tamper with certain established economic structures, particularly those related to land ownership patterns set during colonial times, you are somehow violating a fundamental value. It conveniently sidesteps the uncomfortable truth that the existing distribution of land is the result of a profound violation of values, the values of equality, justice, and human dignity for the majority of the population for centuries. It's like telling someone they can't rebuild their stolen house because it might upset the person currently, unlawfully, living in it. The pressure on South Africa regarding its land policy demonstrates how core values can be selectively interpreted and deployed to protect established interests, even when those interests are rooted in historical injustice. It's a way of saying, yes, address injustice, but please do it in a way that doesn't upset the current economic order too much, an order from which, coincidentally, many external entities continue to benefit. This external hand-wringing makes an already complex internal process even more difficult, attempting to constrain South Africa's sovereign right to determine its own path towards a more equitable future for all its citizens. Here's where it gets really juicy, like a political satire show writing its own material. Western nations, quite rightly, champion values like democracy, human rights and the rule of law. General Langley does it, diplomats do it, presidents do it. It's all very commendable. They demand that African nations adhere strictly to these principles. Fair enough, you might think, but then you glance over their shoulder and see some of the company they keep, or rather the company their companies keep. And that's when you might need to fetch your spectacles for a closer look at the fine print. It's no secret that many Western-based multinational corporations operating in Africa have, at times, been associated with practices that don't exactly scream human rights champion or environmental steward of the year. Think about exploitative labor conditions in mines or factories, or the environmental degradation caused by some extractive industries, or complex tax arrangements that see vast profits spirited away from African treasuries. These things happen, and while they happen, the official governmental discourse from the West towards African states often remains firmly fixed on the core values lecture. It's a bit like a fitness instructor chain smoking while telling you about the benefits of clean living. This creates a glaring double standard, a kind of values for thee, but not necessarily for our economic interests operating within thee. African nations are expected to demonstrate unwavering loyalty to these Western-defined values to align their foreign policies, their economic choices, and even their internal governance structures accordingly. There's an implicit, sometimes explicit, demand for allegiance. Yet, the same level of scrutiny is rarely applied to Western economic actors on the continent, especially when their activities are profitable. The values seem to have an asterisk attached, a little footnote saying terms and conditions may apply if it affects our bottom line. This isn't just hypocrisy, it's damaging. It undermines the credibility of the core values message and breeds resentment. It suggests that the concern isn't genuinely about universal principles, but about maintaining a particular kind of global order, one where African nations are compliant and their resources remain accessible under favorable terms. If core values are truly universal, they should apply equally to everyone, including powerful nations and their corporations in their dealings with Africa, not just as a set of rules for Africa. Otherwise, it just looks like a very sophisticated, very polite power play. Now, it's not all one-way traffic, this core values monologue. African leaders are increasingly pushing back, asserting their agency, and reminding the world that Africa is a continent of diverse sovereign nations, not a problem to be solved or a pupil to be endlessly lectured. Take Captain Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso. His government's decision to review military partnerships with former colonial powers like France and explore new alliances, say with Russia or other non-Western actors, is a clear statement of intent. It's about seeking solutions that, in his view, better serve Burkina Faso's specific security needs and national interests. This isn't just about swapping one international partner for another, it's a deeper assertion of sovereignty. Traoré's rhetoric often emphasizes national dignity, self-reliance, and the right of Burkina Faso to choose its own path, free from external dictation. When he speaks about taking control of the nation's security and its resources, he's directly challenging the notion that African countries must always align with traditional Western powers or adhere to their prescribed models of governance and partnership. It's a bold move and one that clearly ruffles feathers, precisely because it signals a refusal to simply play by the old rules of the game. Similarly, President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa has consistently defended his country's right to an independent foreign policy. Think about the varied responses to the conflict in Ukraine. South Africa, along with many other nations in the global south, has advocated for a negotiated peace and resisted pressure to unequivocally align with the Western stance. Ramaphosa has articulated that South Africa's position is guided by its own historical experiences and its commitment to multilateralism and peaceful conflict resolution. He's effectively saying, we hear you, but we have our own perspective and we will act according to our own assessment of our national interests and global peace. This kind of pushback, whether it's Traore's more radical recalibration or Ramaphosa's firm but diplomatic assertion of independence, is crucial. It's African leaders saying, we are not just passive recipients of your values or your policies. We have our own visions, our own priorities, and our own agency. They are challenging the idea that loyalty to Western interests is a prerequisite for international legitimacy. This assertion of African agency is vital for reshaping global power dynamics and moving towards more equitable relationships, where African voices are not just heard but genuinely respected and heeded. So, after all this talk of core values, Western pressure and African responses, what's the takeaway? Well, it seems pretty clear that while noble-sounding principles like democracy and human rights are in themselves things most people would cheer for, the way they're often packaged and delivered by powerful Western nations can be problematic. General Langley's well-intentioned speeches about these values, when viewed from a Pan-African perspective, can easily look like another chapter in a long book titled How to Keep Africa Aligned with Western Interests. It's less about a shared journey, more about a guided tour where the guide has all the maps and decides all the stops. The constant moralizing, the subtle and not so subtle loyalty tests. Are you with us or against us on this issue? Are your policies reflecting our understanding of good governance? Don't really build the foundations for a genuine partnership. So, true partnership, like any good friendship, isn't about one side constantly setting the terms and judging the other. It's about mutual respect, understanding different contexts, and acknowledging that sovereignty means actually being, well, sovereign. It means Africa gets to define its own path, even if that path sometimes makes its Western friends a bit uncomfortable, or means they have to adjust their own long-held expectations. What's needed isn't more lectures on core values from one side, but more accountability from all sides. Western nations need to take a long, hard look at their own historical and ongoing roles in Africa, including the actions of their corporations and the impact of their foreign policies. Exploiting resources while preaching about governance isn't a good look on anyone. There needs to be a genuine willingness to engage with African nations as equals, to listen to their concerns and to respect their right to self-determination, even when their choices don't perfectly mirror Western models or immediately serve Western geopolitical aims. Ultimately, if the goal is a stable, prosperous and self-reliant Africa, and let's hope that's a shared goal, then the approach needs to change. It's time to move beyond the framework of donors and recipients, mentors and pupils, and instead build relationships based on genuine reciprocity, shared understanding, and a clear-eyed acknowledgement of past and present power imbalances. African nations are not looking for patrons, they are looking for partners. And real partners don't demand loyalty. They earn trust through consistent, respectful, and equitable engagement. That's the core value worth striving for.